today is the 13th of Decem-Baron 2020, and, well, you may have noticed that stack of books behind me. That is all of the Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition books that my wife and I own. That collection has started since, for about 5-ish years now. And, I would like to, so I've been sharing a lot of stories about, my previous campaigns and things like that, and there are lots of others that I haven't shared yet. Today I'm going to focus on I'm going to tell you about the published adventures that I have played so far. Well, most of them. There are still stories yet to be shared for the future, but I wanted to go over all the published adventures that I have gone through, and also what each of these books are for. If you're not familiar with Dungeons & Dragons, this will also be a kind of a good sort of, at least you can see my take on the use of each of these books. These are not all of the books that are out there, by the way. These are just the ones that I wanted. So, anyway, but yeah, so the main focus is, I want to talk about published adventures that I've done, part 1, essentially. While I've done a good number of homebrew campaigns, especially more recently, as I've been involved in more and more campaigns, I've been falling back on published adventures published by Wizards of the Coast. They publish 1 or 2 adventures a year usually, maybe a little more, things like that, and they have other source books and things like that. But I've played or have DM'd quite a few of these. Not all of them, but most of them. And, yeah, as I go over each of them, I'll explain my, my brief history with them, and so forth. So, just double checking something. Okay. Hey, sorry, I got a text message. Okay, it's something I can take care of later today. Alright, so first of all, I'm going to start with these 3 books here. These are the core books that I've shown before. The Player's Hand. So, now, it is possible to purchase all of these. Now, in general, if you're interested in Dungeons & Dragons, there are certainly other hobbies out there that are more expensive. For example, if you are into, like Warhammer or something like that, a box of miniatures, maybe about half a dozen of these kind of miniatures can be like $50 or more. Just for one, and you want like a whole army of people, right? So that's ridiculous. As well as like terrain and things like that. It still can be a bit spendy, but so the reason I have all these is I decided I really wanted to invest in this particular hobby, along with board games and video games, certain kinds. Anyway, but yeah, it is possible to buy each of these books digitally. There's a website called D&D Beyond that has all the books available. You can have like an annual subscription that lets you have access to all the books, or you can also just buy them individually if you want. These books, each of these books tend to be about $50 if you buy them physically at a store. However, I have been able to find most, if not all, of these books online, for example, Amazon, for about $30, plus maybe some shipping. This is not a sponsored video, by the way. I'm just explaining in case, those of you who are curious. But of course, also, Dungeons & Dragons can be played, or tabletop RPGs can be played however you want. So you can invest as little or as much as you want. It's just I chose to invest this much. So first of all, the Player's Handbook is pretty much the only thing that players really need. If you must buy a book, this would be the one to get, because it has all the basics of the rules of Dungeons & Dragons. It has all the basic races and classes and spells and things like that. Now there are other books that have more races, more classes, and more spells, but these are the very basics. Everything else is built on, everything else rules-wise is built on this. Now, there's also, of course, there are also 2 other books that I've shown. There's the Monster Manual, which is essentially just a collection of just all kinds of different monsters. And I've showed images and stuff like that. This is one of the books that Dungeon Masters really need. Generally need in order to be able to play monsters effectively. have all the monsters stats and everything. It's essentially like a shortened, like a little character sheet for each little character sheet for each monster. And then the Dungeon Master's Guide has additional rules, additional options, a lot of sort of like basic Dungeons and Dragons lore. It talks about the different planes of existence. It had probably one of the biggest things are all the magic items that are in there. All the possible cool magic items. There are also lots of other sorts of rules. There are ways to build your own dungeons if you want, that kind of thing. So it's a guide for dungeon masters. And so those are the 3 books that are considered the core books. Those were the first ones published in the 5th edition rules of Dungeons and Dragons back in 2015 or so. Was it 2015? 2014, something like that. So there were, of course, previous editions of Dungeons and Dragons. There are other videos that explain, what 1st, 2nd, 3rd, and 4th edition, 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 3.5, and 4th edition were all about. And I know a bit of that history, but I'm not going to talk about that today because I don't think I need to. That information is already out there. I'm here to talk about my experiences with what I have, and my experience is focused on the latest edition, 5th edition, which, anyway, it's. I think Dungeons and Dragons wasn't always popular, but with among the things that helped make it popular, one of the things was how accessible the 5th edition rules are compared to previous editions. So now we move on to the published adventures. So those three books kind of give all the rules, all the basic spells, all the those on those 3 alone, on those 3 books alone, you could. That you're pretty much set. You don't necessarily need anything else except, of course, a way to roll dice, whether digitally or physically, as well as there's the character sheets and all that. But that's explained in all those books. If you want to go, if you don't want to make your own homebrew adventure, you can take a published adventure. Basically, you take one of these books and it explains the whole setting, and there's a sort of plot or different branching plots and things like that. Everything you would need, all a dungeon master would have to do is read the book, and they would know everything they needed to be able to run the setting and run the adventure and things like that. Now, of course, everything in Dungeons and Dragons are guidelines. They're suggestions. You can change the published adventures however you want, and I certainly have done that. The very first published adventures in 5th edition I actually do not have. First of all, there's the starter set that I do not have. That's probably the best place to start. It has everything that players and dungeon masters need to play Dungeons and Dragons, to basically try it out, to see if they like it enough to buy more books. The starter set has an adventure called Lost Mine of Phandelver. Pretty decent starting adventure and everything. Has everything you need to play. I don't have that because I haven't felt a need to purchase it myself. Then, after that, Wizards of the Coast published an adventure, a storyline called Tyranny of Dragon. It came in 2 books, actually. One called Hoard of the Dragon Queen, and the other called The Rise of Tiamat. Now, I will also say, I will probably be divulging some light spoilers for these. I don't plan to give everything away for these in case you decide to play these yourself. But I'll say as much as I feel I should to give an idea for the flavor and the sense of what the adventure is all about. The Tyranny of Dragon storyline, Hoard of the Dragon Queen and Rise of Tiamat, I have never DM'd, but I have played through as a player once. I considered getting the books. It goes from level 1 to level 15. But I decided not to in the end because my friend who DM'd the storyline for me and my wife and other friends, he said that it's not written particularly well, especially compared to other adventures. It was the first adventure in 5th edition. Wizards of the Coast were still trying to figure out exactly how to make 5th edition work and everything. The writing in the books apparently makes a lot of assumptions about what the players will do. It's not particularly descriptive in some places and perhaps too descriptive in others. Basically, it's a neat story, and where you follow dragon worshipping cults who have been amassing hoards of treasure in the hopes that the evil the evil queen of dragons, Tiamat, this five-headed, monster of a dragon, will rise and be freed from the nine hells and come into the material plane to wreak havoc and destroy the world and everything. And it's up to the players to track down the dragon cults and figure out what's going on and stop the rise of Tiamat, essentially. It was fun to go through. I just decided ultimately to not buy those books because I didn't. There are other adventure, like pretty much any other adventure after that is written and organized a lot better. The next one is this one. Princes of the Apocalypse is the title of the Elemental Evil storyline that came after Tyranny of Dragons. I have never DM'd this nor played this before, but I've read a bit of it so far. And essentially, this is another one where there are cults that want to destroy the world, except there are four, one for each of the elements: earth, air, fire, and water. And they're each trying to destroy the world in their own way, essentially. And so you have to deal with each of those. Princes of the Apocalypse, pretty cool, I think. Out of the Abyss. This was the adventure that was. I'm trying to avoid the glare of the computer there. This was the adventure that was active, or was most recent when I started playing Dungeons and Dragons. This is the Underdark Adventure. I told you that my character, Yarharet Tintunabular, was having a hard time in the Underdark. Well, this was it. Out of the Abyss is about going in, being held captive in the Underdark, deep underground, and trying to survive down there. There's a little bit of, and it's called Out of the Abyss because demon lords from the Abyss are being set free in the Underdark, and that's a problem. This is one of the demon lords. Demogorgon is its name. This two-headed, giant of a monster. And there are other demon lords that are just equally terrifying. There's Zuktmoy, the demon queen of fungus. There's Gradst. There's Orcus, demon lord of the undead, and all that kind of stuff. So yeah, I've run a little. So I didn't have. I had a bit of a frustrating experience, with my character trying to survive in the Underdark. But there's some cool things in here. Alice and the writers of this adventure were inspired by Alice in Wonderland type stuff, because there's dark, dangerous stuff in this adventure, but there's also strange and quirky things as well. You can certainly feel some of that Lewis Carroll influence in bits and parts of this adventure. I've never run this entire thing, but I've used it for I've used bits and pieces of this adventure for other campaigns. Which I'll share that story later. This was the first published adventure I purchased, Curse of Strahd. And this was the one I'm most familiar with. This is my absolute favorite, because not only is it the first published adventure I ran as a dungeon master, I've run it 4 or 5 times, and I'm even now running it for a group of players, because this is just, honestly, it's a favorite of many people, even not just me. This is classic gothic horror. Strahd von Zarovich is the name of this vampire lord here, and essentially you are stuck in this, this awful place called Barovia. And there's a really previous adventures were not so open world. This one is, though. There's a small world you get to explore. There's vampires, werewolves, ghosts, all kinds of things. Anything you could ever want from classic gothic horror is basically in here. Very, very well done. This is when they really Wizards of the Coast really started to come into their own. And I would say more about my experiences with running this, but that warrants its own episode, honestly. So I'm going to save those stories for a later time when I talk about, all the different Curse of Strahd adventures that are going on. So, but yeah, very, very cool. It's also just a classic among people who've played D&D for decades and decades. Castle Ravenloft is the name of the castle that this vampire lord is in, and it is a labyrinth, let me tell you. So many things to love about that adventure. There's also a cool mechanic where you come across a tarot card reading fortune teller, and she reads the cards, and essentially that tells you where to find certain magic items that'll help you in your eventual clash against Strahd von Zarovich. So, after that was Storm King's Thunder. This is essentially a campaign focused on giants. Hill giants, frost giants, fire giants, storm giants, or other kind of cloud giants. Um, the basic idea is that the ordning, which is the term for the order of the giants, because there's a hierarchy among giants. Hill giants are at the bottom, and storm giants are at the top, with a certain order in there. But the ordning has somehow shattered. Something has gone awry in among the giants, and they are wreaking havoc in the world, trying to reestablish the ordning in their own favor. Each of the different types. And perhaps surprisingly enough, Shakespearean drama is what inspired some of this adventure. You see the Storm King, which is pictured here, and his two daughters. There's a certain kind of drama that happens between these characters, which is not necessarily discovered until much later, because the pressing issue is different giants like wreaking havoc. But as the players go on, you figure out that there's some sort of Shakespeare-like drama happening, and stuff like that. I imagine something kind of like King Lear or whatever. So I have never DM'd this, but I have been a player in it. Really cool. There's some cool runes. You can see some of the runes kind of like circling around the area there. But yeah, if you like giants and the different types of giants, and the giants, kind of like in a small way, it's kind of like the Princes of the Apocalypse, but giant specific. So there you go. And also, it's rather fitting that there is an adventure earlier about dragons, and there's one about giants, because giants and dragons are enemies essentially. Okay, so after that, this book was published. Tales from the Yawning Portal. The Yawning Portal is a tavern run by this guy, Durnan. It has its name because there's a big hole in the middle of it. This big well that goes into a mega dungeon called the Undermountain, which I'll mention in a little bit. What's interesting about this is that you could make a campaign out of this, but essentially what this is, it is about 7 dungeons from previous editions of Dungeons and Dragons, rewritten for 5th edition. And again, you could tie the dungeons together, but you could also just take whichever dungeon you want. In here is the infamous Tomb of Horrors dungeon, which is back in like the early days of the 70s and 80s. One of the creators of Dungeons and Dragons, in the first place, Gary Gygax, made this especially like very slow, puzzly, like deadly dungeon called Tomb of Horrors. And it is now in 5th edition, although it is not, like, because of the rules of 5th edition, it's not as deadly as the original, but as a dungeon master, you certainly can make it as deadly as you want. So yeah, I've run Tomb of Horrors before, in 5th edition. I really like some of the tricky, nasty things that are in it. You'll have to explain to the player, like, the Tomb of Horrors is kind of an acquired taste, though. Because it's not a run in and beat the bad guy. It's run in and check every square inch with a 10-foot pole, essentially. I've run a few dungeons in here. There's some really cool things in this book. I haven't made a full campaign out of this, but there's some cool ones in here. All right, moving on. So on the theme of Tomb of Horrors, we have Tomb of Annihilation. There are a couple so I've run this adventure a couple of times. Another one of my favorites, actually. A couple of different things are happening here. First of all, this is taking place not in a more so there's the generic fantasy setting of Faerun, the Forgotten Realms, and everything, which all of these generally take place. Although you can have these take place wherever you want. In that world, there is a more tropical kind of Amazonian place called Chult, and in Chult there are there are different customs. There are dinosaurs. There's undead dinosaurs. There's a T-Rex zombie that vomits other zombies, that kind of thing. So if you're into that kind of thing, this could be really cool for you. Trying to survive in a jungle and that kind of thing. The titular Tomb of Annihilation, though, was built by this guy, Acererak, who's also on the cover of the Dungeon Master's Guide. Acererak is a very powerful lich who built Tomb of Horrors. And he also built, so in this, he built another dungeon, which in this one's called Tomb of Annihilation or Tomb of the Nine Gods. It is not, so the Tomb of the Nine Gods is much bigger, there's a lot more going on in there, and there's a secret plot that Acererak has that the players can try to thwart, because there's some sort of death curse that's plaguing the world, and it's all started with the Tomb of Annihilation. Very fun. It can be brutal. There's even a meat grinder mode where, it's easier to outright die in it if you want. So I've run this a few times. I really like it. I love the Tomb of the Nine Gods as well at the very end. Acererak is a fun villain to play. He just has some really nasty things for people who want to try to beat him. Now here's another very fun one. There are 2 Waterdeep books. Waterdeep is the name of a city in the Forgotten Realms. This one is called Dragon Heist. Dragon Heist is essentially, so it's a bit different in that it's more of a intrigue adventure. There's not a lot of combat, but there's a lot of social interactions. There's a lot of, there's sort of an Ocean's 11 feel to it, if you want. Excuse me, been talking too much. Also, what's really cool is that I've run this once and I had a lot of fun with this. There are 5 characters pictured on the cover here. There's this big beholder back here. There's this there's dapper looking drow. There's this rich couple, and then there's this robed figure. These are all possible villains. What happens is, at least as written anyway, the Dungeon Master chooses one of the 4 seasons to have the story take place in: spring, summer, fall, or winter. Each of those seasons corresponds with one of these 4 villains. These 2 count as one villain, this rich couple here. Each villain is associated with one of the seasons. Although you can have the villains interact, together if you want, but if you choose one season, you can have that season and that villain be the focus of the story if you wish. And depending on what the Dungeon Master and the players want, like if you want it to be in spring, summer, fall, or winter. Dragon Heist refers to a pile of 500,000 dragons, and in here, dragons is the term for gold pieces. So 500,000 gold pieces is sitting somewhere underneath Waterdeep, and each of these villains wants that for their own reasons. And it's up to the play, and if any of these villains get their hands on that money, something bad will certainly happen. Like they each have their own agenda, and it's up to the players to stop that agenda from moving forward. So very cool. And Waterdeep in general is just a very fun city to play in. That's where the Yawning Portal Tavern is as well. So most of these adventures are around levels 1 to 10 or 1 to 15. Dragon Heist is only levels 1 to 5. Then Waterdeep Dungeon of the Mad Mage is levels 5 to 15. Or actually no, level 5 to 20. You know that mega dungeon I mentioned earlier underneath the Yawning Portal? That's this dungeon. Imagine a dungeon, okay? Imagine something like a Zelda dungeon or whatever. Imagine the size of that. Imagine it has, several dozen rooms generally, some big, some small, and that kind of thing, and had its own sort of way of doing things. It had its own types of creatures and everything. Yeah, so do you have an idea of what a dungeon is in your mind? Good. Imagine about 25 dungeons stacked on top of each other. Each dungeon is a different floor in a mega dungeon. That's what this is. I have not been able to run this yet, but I have read this entire book because I was really, really curious and interested to see what each level entailed. And the deeper you go, the crazier it gets until you get to this guy. He is the Mad Mage, essentially. You also notice that these 2 books kind of mirror each other, right? So, there's a beholder in the back of this one, and there's an undead beholder in the back of this one. There's a drow in the middle. There's different villains and everything. There's a wizard at the bottom of each. So that's kind of cool, I think. But yeah, I hope to be able to run this at some point. It's more of a dungeon crawl kind of a thing, but there's something really cool and interesting on every single level of this mega dungeon. So this is certainly a rather meaty campaign for those who want it. After that was another sort of Tales of the Yawning Portal type book in Ghosts of Saltmarsh. This is a series of about 7 adventures from previous editions of Dungeons & Dragons, but they all have a sort of seafaring or aquatic theme to it. Saltmarsh is the name of a small port town that had its own struggles and economy and things like that. You could make I've made a whole campaign out of this before. It's quite fun. Some adventures lead into others and things like that. But yeah, so if you want a more seafaring kind of thing, with a healthy dose of undead creatures and monsters and things like that, Ghost of Saltmarsh is another fun campaign as well. Now we're getting into ones that were published in the past year or so. Descent into Avernus. So Baldur's Gate: Descent into Avernus is I've run this once or twice before. This is essentially you go into the 9 hells. Well, specifically the 9 hells get this name because there's 9 layers to hell in Dungeons and Dragons. Avernus is the top layer of hell. It is the first one that people tend to go to when they go to hell, essentially. Baldur's Gate is the name of another city in the Forgotten Realms, Baldur's Gate is essentially a wretched hive of scum and villainy, really. And sort of what's going on with this one is that not Baldur's Gate, but another town has been dragged into hell, and it's up to the players to investigate what's happening and why that whole city was dragged under, and to try to bring the city back and to prevent Baldur's Gate from suffering the same fate. So this is a really, really cool adventure. There's just some really gnarly things in it, and also Mad Max Fury Road stuff. Okay? Mad Max Fury Road is what inspired some of... you basically get to ride infernal war machines. Alright? There's different kinds, different shapes and sizes with different weapons on it, and that kind of thing. So imagine Mad Max Fury Road meets hell, and you've got it. By the way, if you know me, Baron Dipidus from Brawlhalla, there's a character in the game Brawlhalla named Zariel. That's the name of this character right here, actually. Zariel used to be an archangel, but something happened, and which is explained in the adventure, in which she became corrupted and became an archdevil now. And she is reaching for her holy sword, stuff like that. So yeah, Descent into Avernus, really, really crazy place. And also, each of these books, most of these books, come with a really cool fold-out map, all right? A lot of these maps have, spoilers on it. This one, not so much. So these maps tend to be two-sided. So on one side is the city that got dragged into hell, and on the other side is the map that you give to players of Avernus itself, okay? You see it's not labeled. You kind of, there are some landmarks here and there, though. But, these maps look really, really cool. Really pretty. I better get a move on. I have something in about 15 minutes, so... but yeah. So, I have a few more books to talk about, and I'll get there in a second. But I have not mentioned a few of the other books that I don't have. There is a Stranger Things starter set. There's a second starter set called Dragon of Icespire Peak. There's also a Rick and Morty source book. I'm not a fan of Rick and Morty, that's why I don't have that. I did get this book, though. There's a long-running podcast called Acquisition Incorporated, which essentially take the humor from the TV show The Office, all the office and business bureaucracy, and add it to a fantasy setting. That's Acquisition Incorporated. So this is mostly a source book on how to make your own Acquisition Incorporated adventure. But there's also a small adventure level 1 to 6 in here. And I'm actually running this right now with some friends. There's all sorts of strange, kooky, wacky things that happen. And if you're a fan of the show Acquisition Incorporated, there's a lot to love about this book. I'm not a fan of the show myself. I've never really listened to it, but I like the idea of, putting business into D&D. And so it's kind of fun, running your own franchise and the adventure and stuff. So yeah. There you go. It's also kind of more cartoonish style than most of the other books, which I think is fun. So yeah, there are little source books like this, but that's really the only other one that I have. And now, the most recent adventure is called Icewind Dale: Rime of the Frost Maiden. So it's been a while since Wizards of the Coast published a horror campaign, right? Most of the other ones, Tomb of Annihilation, there's scary stuff there, but there's more kind of adventure and Indiana Jones style sort of thing. The last real horror adventure was Curse of Strahd. This one is survival horror on ice, essentially. The Frost Maiden, of course, is this creature right here on the cover. And the map doesn't even tell you all that much. There's a lot in the adventure. I've started reading it. I haven't quite run it yet. But there's not a lot on the map, right? There's towns, there's settlements in there. And there are a few, there's glaciers and mountains and things like that. But there's a lot on the map that, it's a lot, in the adventure that the map doesn't tell you. So I know the basic gist of the adventure in here. There's some really cool, interesting things. There's a little bit of aliens or mind flare kind of stuff happening, but mostly, the Frost Maiden has cursed the Icewind Dale area into a perpetual winter. Now it's cold there normally, but she's made it so the sun doesn't rise at all. It barely peeks over the mountains and then just stays down, which is a problem for all the people that are trying to survive in Icewind Dale in the first place. So you're trying to figure out what's going on with the Frost Maiden, why she did that, and there are other plots and things like that are happening. So those are the adventures, and those are those are my feelings about them. And again, I'll dedicate a whole episode to Curse of Strahd in the future. But there's one more type of book I haven't really talked about. I talked about source books before. Source books are the types of books that are just kind of here are a bunch of options, here are a bunch of fun things you can put in your campaign. There's a Rick and Morty source book, like I said, an Acquisitions Incorporated source book. There's a Stranger Things starter set. I don't know much about that Stranger Things starter set, but it looks like it's in the style of the 80s or whatever, back when when Dungeons and Dragons was still pretty new. But and there are also other source books that if you're familiar with Magic the Gathering, as far as I know, there's lore in that card game, and there are different planes and worlds and stuff like that. So there's a source book for several of those different Magic the Gathering worlds, Theros, Ravnica. I've heard about. There's also other settings that people like from years past, like Eberron had its own book, that kind of thing. I don't have those books because I don't have a connection to those sorts of settings. But I do have these. So we have Volo's Guide to Monsters, Xanathar's Guide to Everything, Mordenkainen's Tome of Foes, and Tasha's Cauldron of Everything. Volo, Xanathar, Mordenkainen, and Tasha are all characters in the Forgotten Realm setting, the typical Forgotten Realm setting of Dungeons and Dragons. And they all have their own they all have their own lore, their own stories and things like that. Each of these books, though, they're a real book in the setting of Dungeons and Dragons. Some more common than others, but essentially they're source books. Volo's Guide to Monsters has a lot of new lower level monsters, just smaller monsters and things like that, that can be used in a campaign. I guess there are bookmarks in there and stuff. Also, there's more information about hags, about mind flayers, about beholders and things like that. New ways to, different layers that they have, and orcs and things like that. So it's really a guide to popular monsters, and there's new monsters in it, and there are new character races as well. If you want to be half angel instead of half devil, you can be an Aasimar. If you want to be a fish person, you can be a Triton. If you want to be, there's lizard folk. There's a really silly race called Kenku, which are basically bird people that can't talk, but they can mimic other sounds. So, that they've heard. So, yeah. Stuff like that. But anyway, there's that. Volo's Guide to Monsters. Next is Xanathar's Guide to Everything. This is Xanathar the Beholder, with his prized goldfish, Silgar. Xanathar's Guide to Everything is just Wizards of the Coast, they often publish something that's kind of they often publish playtesting things. We're considering including this class or this race or this set of rules into Dungeons and Dragons. And they would, publish it for free for people to try out and playtest and, give feedback. And the stuff that is well received goes in books like this. So there's just sort of a hodgepodge of all kinds of things. There's lesser magic items. There's new downtime activities. There are different archetypes. For example, for bards, generally in the player's handbook, there are two types of bards you can be. You can be in the College of Valor or the College of Lore. And in here, they introduced 3 new types of bards. There's the College of Whispers, College of Swords, and College of Glamour. And each of them have their own different types of abilities, and they have more archetypes for each of the classes, and so on and so forth. All right, and just all sorts of like random, like different types of rules, different things that dungeon masters can use if they want. So yeah, so because it's sort of a hodgepodge, that's why that's called Xanathar's Guide to Everything. Now let's move on to, so Mordenkainen is a very powerful wizard that travels the planes to try to keep things in balance. Mordenkainen's Tome of Foes have more monsters, mostly high-level monsters like archdevils, demon lords. There's a monster called an Astral Dreadnought, which is something you might run into if you go out like in the astral plane or something. See if I can find a good picture of it in here. It is just like, here we go. Astral Dreadnought, this floating thing right here. There's like this gargantuan, just like nasty thing. There's also like devilish moss and stuff in here. There's all like just crazy things you find all around in the plains. There's also more lore in here about like how elves came, like different conflicts in the multiverse. About there's stuff about the Blood War, about the war between demons and devils. There's stuff about conflicts between different types of dwarves, different types of elves, things like that. If you want more information on that, so Mordenkainen's Tome of Foes, and the most recent published book from Wizards of the Coast overall is Tasha's Cauldron of Everything. I was really excited about this one. Tasha seems like a really cool character. She's basically a powerful wizard or witch who was raised by Baba Yaga. Baba Yaga is a witch with a hut that has, that walks on big chicken legs. This is another sort of hodgepodge of things, but in this case, there are new spells, new magic items and artifacts, more archetypes for characters. There's also a new class called Artificer, a tinkerer kind of a thing. Just all sorts of like magical miscellany and just lots of cool stuff that dungeon masters can use. So yeah, those are my experiences and thoughts and feelings about the published books of Dungeons and Dragons up to this point in 5th edition. On some other day I will talk especially about all the different campaigns I ran in Curse of Strahd specifically. I didn't have a lot to say about the different campaigns I ran in some of these other books because I ran the adventure. It's fun. They're generally quite well written and imaginative, and you can tweak them however you want. But yeah, there you go. Thank you for being here. I'll see you tomorrow. All the best.